book discussion, Coffeeland by Augustine Sedgewick, a book about the history of coffee, in particular through the lens of a coffee plantation owner in El Salvador, explaining the history of coffee, the business of coffee, and how a commodity like that has influence on politics. This is the Not Even Wrong podcast. It's January 24th, 2021. This is Krimdelko. Today's Sunday. There's no update. I want to talk about a book I recently read. It's Coffeeland by Augustine Sedgewick. Sedgwick's a professor in New York. He is in particular interested in food, the history of food, and the influence of food on people, societies, and politics. And I think Coffeeland is a great example of how a simple thing like coffee plantations can draw a line across countries, centuries, societies, politics, and really show how we evolve through many vectors. So we as a human species, we always think about the concept of free will, and we decide what happens and we shape our future. And to some extent, that's obviously true. We at Orange Capital Partners strongly believe in that. But there's also this point that sometimes developments or things shape us. And I think this book, Coffeeland, is in that light, is to be read in that light of how certainly, let's say, a relatively benign strategy or desire by people, in this case, a gentleman named James Hill, who is an immigrant from Manchester in the late 19th century to El Salvador, realizes that there is incredibly favorable climate for coffee, that coffee is on the rise as a commodity, and starts a coffee plantation, creates a coffee industry, which on its own again creates the breeding ground for revolutionary wars, becomes for a short while in the 70s and 80s actually almost a substitute war between the US and Russia, and sort of the next or Vietnam 2.0. The Reagan-Contra crisis is part of that. Lots of people die. Terrible situation for people in El Salvador and also other Central American countries. So this idea of coffee being a commodity that is grown as a monoculture then proliferates into this terrible situation politically. And it just shows us that unintended consequences can happen when we do very extreme top-down things. On the other hand, also, the book shows the evolution of coffee as a cultural phenomenon, starting with monks in Yemen that drink coffee that originates from Ethiopia, then through the Ottoman Empire, the entrance into Europe, Vienna in particular, and then the whole concept of drinking coffee becoming a cultural phenomenon, a coffee shop phenomenon, the cafe, the Viennese cafe. Discussions are being held, political discussions, revolutions are being designed in coffee shops. And I think that even holds up today. The coffee shop in San Francisco, which is sometimes, at least in a virtual way, the breeding ground for new startups and new technologies, and changing the world out of a coffee shop because you drink this substance that somehow sparks ideas and conversations. And I think we all have this experience. Sometimes we sit down, we at Orange Capital Partners very often in the morning go for a walk, sit down, have a coffee, and very often do through these walks and in the coffee experience have conversations that can lead to interesting ideas, or at least can help us formulate our thoughts in a better way. So Coffeeland is about all these things, and I think it's a very nice book. It's not a page turner in any way. It's not a revelation to the point where you really sit down and think about this like maybe some other books that we've read recently. But it's an interesting book again, and I think it's worth mentioning here. Oh, by the way, it's also, I think it's a nice literally prelude to the movie Salvador by Oliver Stone. I've spoken about Oliver Stone in the past. His biography, Searching the Light, is one of the books that really influenced us, in a very positive way, by showing us that creativity and uniqueness can lead to enormous value creation. But anyway, this is not about Oliver Stone, but his movie Salvador is a very short and concise picture of El Salvador in the 70s. And the book Coffeeland is sort of a prelude, the 50 years that led towards that terrible situation that is described in that movie. So again, the book is about the history of coffee. I don't want to give away too much. It's a nonfiction book. So there's a family, the Hill family, that starts by James Hill going to El Salvador as a textile salesman for Manchester textile companies, settles there, starts a plantation, and then starts systematically monoculturalize the country by, number one, planting coffee everywhere, but number two, and this is the terrible thing, also taking away other means of substance that the local people could have instead of working on coffee plantation, and therefore make them dependent on working for very low wages in the plantations. It's very hard work, very hard labor. It's really close to slavery. It leads to uprising revolutions in the 1930s. They get brutally killed, those revolutions. People get killed left and right. And then that reemerges in the 70s and 80s. This is kind of the book. It shows also how the local families turn into oligarchies with very bad, particularly the kids and the kids of the kids. They start playing polo, they educate themselves in the US and then waste money and become useless. So it shows a sad history of Central and Latin America in the 20th century, how we often talk about the lost century for that continent. And this is through the lens of one country and one immigrant and one business and one industry, shows why this whole continent is still doomed, because in our view, there's not a lot of change, actually, as far as the elite owns pretty much everything there is to own, and therefore makes it very difficult for everybody else to participate in upward mobility. It also shows how precious the US system is in terms of giving upward mobility and the ability for people in this country to actually profit from economic development and progress. And I think it shows the dangers of monoculture. And I just want to caveat here something. We have a monoculture here in Silicon Valley also. We're very software driven here. So a monoculture can have negative effects even when it's at a very high end. For example, we're not very good at building cars. Tesla is doing it, of course, and succeeding and building a software driven hardware business. But it just shows how difficult it can be. For example, lots of people in Silicon Valley still don't believe in Tesla. And I think it has to do with the mindset and the monoculture mindset. It's very difficult to hire people who can actually build things, who can spend time thinking about things like material science, etc. So it's just always better to have a diversified economy, in a sense that you take away the substance, the way to make a living other than in that particular industry that is dangerous. It's always better to have more opportunities, and therefore an open economy, an economy that is also open by not just legal institutions, but also by mindset, in a sense that, for example, investors are open for new investments. And again, that is something Silicon Valley is not very good at. Silicon Valley is all about low capital, intense, high software centric type businesses with lots of network effects and leverage and things like that. And I mean, other extremes, take Canada. Canada is the famous sentence there whenever you have an investment idea is, what are you digging out of the ground? So monoculture on the mining side. It is obviously sometimes inevitable that we morph towards more, let's say, we all start doing the same thing. We start doing the thing which works, and it's very important to have entrepreneurs that see that and see through that and diversify themselves either within that monoculture or, like, for example, Elon Musk and Tesla, well, then go elsewhere and diversify through the building of other knowledge centers around the world. so you're not stuck in that one particular monoculture. So to summarize, Coffeeland again it's a book about coffee, the history of coffee. It's a nice segue into many different topics: economics, politics, geopolitics. So it's one of those books where, through the lens of one industry and one particular company, even the James Hill Coffee Company that is built around the Santa Ana volcano, excuse me, in Santa Ana, in the volcano landscape of El Salvador, you see geopolitical dimensions there and why they are so relevant. Why was it that there was a communist uprising in El Salvador in the 70s? Well, it was because people were enslaved into the monoculture of coffee plantations, and they were toiling, and they really, like the book says, they had the choice between toiling, between moving away, or um, dying. There was almost no third way, and they chose to die, a lot of them, by doing the uprising. And I think very often this idea, well, there is the risk of communism, should be rephrased as, why is there a risk of communism? What are we doing wrong? And in the case of Central America, the answer is, well, we monoculturalized those countries to the point where they had no other choice than either uprising or leaving, and etc. Today, it's a little bit better in a sense that I think coffee culture has evolved to the point where it's much more granular. There is the opportunity for smaller batches, more higher priced batches. I think this whole fair trade idea is a good intended a thing that actually didn't have the kinds of results that people were hoping for. I think the much better solution is what's happening, for example, here in San Francisco, that you have these very high-end small batch plantations in Central America that are able to command a high price for their beans because of quality. So I think that is the way out, so people can diversify in those countries and build better quality organic coffee, etc., and therefore hopefully get away from that enslaved monoculture, big top-down, sort of big brothers watching you type business practice. I think we're getting away from that. We're still not there. I think those countries have a long way to go, but we're much better off than we were, let's say, 30 to 50 years ago. In terms of what an industry should do, I think an industry, as an industry, of course, cannot do much. An industry is an intangible thing. But the people in the industry, us investors, us players in an industry, we should always keep an open mind and always be against herd thinking. So, like I said, in Silicon Valley, the thinking, everything software is good. And then, for example, take the example of self-driving cars. We have the Silicon Valley way, which is we just throw a lot of hardware and algorithms and sort of Waymo style. We put the human out of the loop and we develop autonomous systems, versus the Tesla way, the Max Tegmark way, which is, hey, wait a minute. We humans are not that stupid. Let us understand what's going on. Let us go step by step, a little bit slower, but much better and under our control. And maybe it's a little bit more capital intensive, but it's much, much better in a way that it's better for us humans. So these are sort of examples where I think the Silicon Valley monoculture is going wrong and where we can counteract. And I think our largest position, Tesla, to some extent does that, and that is a very good thing. Thank you.